But thank you for coming to this Christians on the Left event tonight on how to make tax fair. I'm Hannah Rich, and I have the honour of being the Vice Chair of Christians on the Left. And if this is your first CotL event or your first in a while, a particular welcome to you. We're really pleased that you chose to join us on such a sunny night. Tonight's topic is something that many of us, particularly in Christians on the Left, have been talking about and interested about for years, fairly unfashionably at times, I think it has to be said. However, this week, it maybe feels like that is starting to shift. Not only is this Fair Tax Week, and not only was yesterday Tax Justice Sunday, but we had the momentous news this weekend of the landmark deal agreed by the G7 on corporation tax. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak said that the deal would create a fairer tax system fit for the 21st century. Some campaigners have suggested it perhaps doesn't go far enough, and I'm sure our panel tonight will have plenty to say on that matter when we get to it. Yet within a few hours of the G7 agreeing to those changes in the corporation tax rate, Guido Fawkes, that great bastion of morality and political journalism, had tweeted the following. The Treasury say UK free ports will have the same corporation tax regime as the rest of the UK. After this G7 agreement, Britain will lose control, will not be able to set corporation tax below G7 level. So set your firm up in Ireland with a 12.5% rate. As Christians on the Left, we ran a campaign a few years ago called Patriots Pay Tax, which was aimed not so much at specific policies which would and could make the tax system fairer, although we certainly championed those, but also at changing the whole conversation around tax and why we pay it and why we should be proud to pay it. And that's the exact narrative, that tweet that I just read is the exact narrative that we were trying to address with the Patriots campaign. That idea that many of those who are most vocal about the importance of our national identity and our national economy are, for example, simultaneously some of the first to advocate like that for moving overseas to avoid taxation. So this week of all weeks, I am delighted to be able to have this conversation with such a brilliant panel who I'll introduce shortly. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 5 minutes, and I'll introduce them as we go. We'll then have some time for question and answers. I've got some questions prepared, but it'd be much better if you could submit some as well. So if you could send them in the chat directly to Daniel May Miller, he'll do the honours of collating them for me and sending them over. Could I also ask you to keep the chat where possible to a minimum if you're not asking a question? I know it'll be a fascinating conversation and you'll all have plenty to say about it, but we found it's quite distracting for both our speakers and for other participants to have it constantly pinging the whole way through. If you do have comments, however, and would like to tweet about tonight's event, the hashtags are hashtag CotL Summer, that's COTL Summer, because this is the first in our 2021 summer school, and also hashtag Celebrating Fair, because that's what we're doing tonight. So without any further ado, I will pass it over to the first of our speakers, Justin Thacker. Justin is the Director of Church Action on Tax Justice, has a background in medicine, international development and theology. Most recently, he was Academic Director and Lecturer in Public Theology at Cliff College. He's the author of Global Poverty, a Theological Guide, and has published articles on the intersections of ethics, theology, economics and development. Prior to being a theologian, he worked in international development and also as a paediatrician in Kenya. And among other things, Justin is going to be speaking to us tonight on why Christians should be concerned about taxes and specifically why the tax system needs reforming. Over to you, Justin.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. So in speaking about how to make taxes fair, I think we need to begin by saying why should they be fair in the first place? And given that others on this panel have far more technical expertise than I on the details of tax policy, I'm going to focus my comments on the ethics of tax fairness, in particular in relation to corporation tax. So let's begin then with a reminder as to why corporations should pay a tax on their profits in the first place. I think there are a number of reasons for this, but I'm going to mention 3. And the first of these is simply that corporations benefit enormously from what states and the rest of society contribute towards them. Corporations require a healthy and educated workforce. They need a national and global infrastructure by which they can move their goods and services around. They're dependent on the security and political stability provided by states. There's a reason corporations don't thrive in impoverished, war-torn and fragile states, and it's not simply because their goods and services are not needed or wanted. My point is simply that from day one of trading, a corporation is already in debt to the countries in which it operates for the services it's benefited from. And taxation is at least partly a way to repay that debt. Secondly, as we're all aware, corporate profits can be a primary driver of inequality. I still can't get my head, and I hope I never do, round the idea that just 22 men own the same wealth as all the women in sub-Saharan Africa. Such levels of inequality are obscene, and taxing corporate profits can be a mechanism to reduce or at least prevent the inexorable rise in such inequality. Now, of course, corporations themselves like to claim that the incidence of corporate taxation falls on the consumer or on labour. But in reality, the evidence is that up to 75% of the cost of corporate taxation is felt by shareholders, those wealthy men we've just been talking about. Finally, I'd argue that on environmental grounds alone, we need to be levying some form of corporation tax. For decades, if not centuries, corporations have not been paying for the externalities that are wreaking havoc across the globe. I particularly view this in terms of a global north, global south dynamic. While the lion's share of cumulative greenhouse emissions have been emitted by the global north, the health and economic consequences are felt by those in the global south. It is they whose crops are being destroyed. It is they whose lives and livelihoods are disappearing as a result of climate change. Taxing corporations and redistributing that money to the global south is one way to begin to redress that imbalance. Now, several millennia ago, a very wise person once said this. In fact, they wrote it down on a couple of clay tablets. Do not murder, do not steal, do not covet your neighbour's property. And I'm going to use that framework to talk about the ethics of the points I've just been making very briefly. So firstly, do not steal. If we go into a restaurant and enjoy a meal, but then at the end run away before paying the bill, we're guilty of theft. If we get in a taxi, but at our destination leave without paying, we're guilty of theft. Yet some of our corporations seem to think it's perfectly acceptable to benefit from the state in the way I described earlier, and yet skip away without paying their dues. Such behaviour, it seems to me, is nothing short of theft. Don't covet. Why do we have inequality? Well, there's many reasons, but at its root is the fact that we bought into the lie that greed, or if we use that old term, covetousness, is good. A couple of months ago, our Prime Minister was reported to have said, the reason we have the vaccine success is because of capitalism, because of greed, my friends. Now that, of course, is a load of hokum, but it reflects a pervading ideology that greed is good. But as we all know, it is not. Gross inequality has many negative social and economic consequences. It's bad for those at the low end of the wealth and income distribution, and I'd similarly argue that it's bad for those at the top. For a life consumed by greed and the idolatry of wealth is a denial of who we are as human beings and what we're meant to be. So finally, we're reminded not to murder. Now, you would think that one is obvious, but let me conclude then with one of the most poignant quotations regarding the disproportionate impact of climate change across the world. This is from a medical journal. I quote, "The rich will find their world to be more expensive, inconvenient, uncomfortable, disrupted and colourless, in general more unpleasant and unpredictable, perhaps greatly so. The poor will die. Do not murder, do not steal, do not covet." Those are just some of the reasons why we need to make tax fairer. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Justin. I think there's plenty in that we could ask questions on, and I've got plenty I want to say from that, but we'll save the questions and save the comments for later on. Our next speaker tonight is Paul Monaghan. Paul was a co-founder of the Fair Tax Foundation in 2014 and became the chief executive in September 2017. Previously, he was the architect of much of the UK cooperative movement's ethical and environmental excellence for nearly 2 decades. And before that, he combined biological research with campaigning on third world debt, ethical lending, and sustainability. We're delighted to have Paul with us today in what is probably his most busy or his busiest week of the year. So we're delighted he's taken the time to join us tonight. Over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And I noticed you left off my CV the bit about being a big Wigan Athletic fan, but I'll forgive you this one time. Where we are now on tax justice in the UK is unimaginable even 2 years ago. It is absolutely unbelievable how fast the agenda's moved. One reason for that is the change in the administration of the White House, which has removed many of the blocks to a global solution. Not just removed them because Trump's gone, but because the Joe Biden, Kamala Harris administration has lit a fire under the negotiations. None of us could have conceived of where we are, and it's a good situation. Make no mistake, what happened on Saturday was important. Now, of course, there's much more can be done. And of course, there's many trip points between us and getting to tax justice. But it was an absolutely historic and important movement, and we should pause, because we don't do it enough, to give ourselves a little pat on the back for everything we've done in recent years. It is a phenomenal situation we are in. So I say that as a start point. The solution that we saw arise on Saturday has 2 pillars, and of course both of them can be strengthened. And we had a story in The Guardian today about the way it's drawn up. It might mean Amazon isn't included, and what's been great is within even 24 hours OECD officials are running around saying, we promise you Amazon cloud services will be included. We've already seen since Saturday the French go, when we say at least 15%, we really mean at least 15%. Let's get it north. So let's not take what's on the table and assume this is it. This is a start point. And if we keep mobilizing as a movement, we will get somewhere. And we've always believed at the Fair Tax Foundation and the Fair Tax Mark that people of faith who are active in this area are absolutely essential to a solution. And that's born of my own personal experience of working in fair trade, and socially responsible investment, and third world debt cancellation. People of faith were crucial because you get to speak in people's ears in a manner other people can't. So please don't ever underestimate how important you guys are to what's going on, and more power to your elbows. So in the boring bit is Fair Tax Mark, Fair Tax Foundation. We'll be up to about 70 companies by the end of the month. A few more companies to announce this week, co-ops and social enterprises and FTSE listed businesses. We've got more councils signing up for Councils for Fair Tax. Birmingham City Council just signed up today publicly. That's on top of Edinburgh and Oxford and a whole host of others. And we've got this whole Fair Tax Week going on, because if we don't celebrate the good guys and all we do is we have a pop at the bad guys, it won't work. You have to do both. So I ask you and I beseech you, give credit where it's due. Where corporates are brave enough to stick right above the parapet and not just pay tax, but shout about it and be proud about it. Don't say that they should just be like that, because it is a risk. Their peers will knock them down. There'll be nasty journalists who look for little holes and undermine them. It's a big thing. So we want to do both. We're part of a national alliance and a corporate alliance. We work very closely with Justin and Church Action for Tax Justice, which is wonderful. I'm delighted to say, Louise, Christians on the Left, you've got on board with us right from the beginning. It's great that you're out there running events like this today. So thank you, and everyone, look forward to the Q&A.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. And in the spirit of disagreeing well and not being partisan, I do have to say I did also edit out of Justin's bio the part about him being a long-suffering supporter of Arsenal. So I'm equal opportunities to all football teams tonight, I have to say. Now on to our next speaker, Mary-Anne. Mary-Anne Stephenson has been active in the Women's Budget Group for over 20 years and was appointed as its first director in 2017. Prior to this, she was a freelance consultant specialising in women's equality and human rights, and has been director of the Fawcett Society and a commissioner on the Women's National Commission. She is a trustee of Coventry Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre and also of Just Fair. and she has a PhD in law from the University of Warwick. I'm going to ask Marianne to speak to us now on how tax affects women in particular, and how the system in that regard could be and needs to be reformed. Thanks, Marianne.
Thanks very much, Hannah, and it's really great to be here today. And as both Justin and Paul have said, after a really momentous weekend where we actually saw things shift in a significant and dramatic way. Just say a little bit about the Women's Budget Group for those of you who don't know about us. We are a network of economists, other academics, people from the women's voluntary sector, individuals, trade unionists and others, and we analyse the impact of economic policy on women and men and propose policies that will promote greater gender equality. And tax is something that we have been talking about for over 30 years of our existence. So I wanted to talk just briefly about why tax is a women's issue, and that, I guess, is because women are differently situated in the economy to men, and at the heart that comes down to the unpaid care work that women do. So women do in the UK about 60% more unpaid work than men, most of it care work, which means we have less time for paid work, so we earn less, we own less, and we're more likely to be poor, which means that we are less likely to benefit from cuts to taxation, and more likely to lose out when those things that taxation can help pay for, like public services or social security, are cut. And I thought it was really important, just in talking about climate change and the impact of climate change on the global south, because we know that it's women in the global south who will suffer the most and severest impacts of climate change, not just immediately, but also through forced migration as a result of climate change, which can make women vastly more vulnerable to sexual violence and abuse, for example. So, I mean, if you look in the UK situation, over the 10 years from 2010 until kind of economic policy really changed with COVID, we saw a period which was marked by significant cuts to taxation at the same time as there were dramatic and severe cuts to spending on public services and social security. We did an analysis in about 2018-19, which showed that at that point, the total tax cuts over the period from 2010 totaled about £43 billion a year by 2020. And that happened at the same time as we had massive cuts to public services and £39 billion worth of cuts to social security. So these cuts to public spending were not a political necessity. They were not an economic necessity. They were a political choice, which in part allowed the government to cut taxes. And what we saw as a result of that was that poorer households were hit harder than richer households. Women in every income group lost more than men, and Black and minority ethnic women lost the most of all. And that was because we're more likely to be dependent on social security for a larger proportion of our income, and we gain less from tax cuts. So from the Women's Budget Group point of view, not only do we believe that tax is the necessary contribution that we make to live in a fair and civilized society, both as individuals and corporations, but also tax is a really important way of ensuring that we can pay for the goods and the services that we need and that women in particular are most likely to depend on. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Marianne. And last but by no means least, we'll come to Prem. Prem Sikka is a member of the House of Lords, Emeritus Professor of Accounting at the University of Essex, and also at the University of Sheffield. And more importantly, perhaps co-founder of the Tax Justice Network. He's written widely on corporate governance, accounting practice, and been very vocal against tax avoidance. And we're going to ask him to speak tonight briefly on Labour's vision for tax reform and what some of the things that we've discussed already might look like in policy terms. Over to you, Prem.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to join such a distinguished panel. I don't think I can speak for Labour, but I will speak for myself. For from my perspective, governments really only have two purposes. One is to increase people's prosperity, and second is to increase their happiness. And both are actually in short supply in the UK, because we have, despite being one of the largest economies in the world, we have terrible inequalities which disable lots and lots of people. About the 6 richest people in this country have as much wealth as 13 million ordinary people, and the 100 richest have more wealth than 18 million. 10% of the households have 44% of wealth, and the poorest 50% have just 9%. These inequalities matter because they control access to good food, housing, education, health, pension, and as COVID has shown us, also to how long somebody might live. Too many poor people have been condemned to early death. So we actually need to address these inequalities by redistributing income and wealth. And one way of doing that is by embracing progressive taxation. But actually governments, successive governments, have actually embraced regressive tax policies. So the net result is that the poorest 10% of households pay around 47.6% of their income in direct and indirect taxes, compared to 33.5% by the richest 10% of households. And if anything, wage freezes and austerity has made that worse, because people's income is capped while council tax and everything else is going up. Wherever we look, we have regressive taxation. VAT at 20% is incredibly regressive. Whether somebody's a millionaire or a pauper, they pay tax at exactly the same rate. And inevitably, people have to spend their money sparingly, and they concentrate on what they actually essentially need. And that means the economy is not really stimulated at all. If you look at council tax, it is also regressive. A property worth 3 million or £350,000 pays virtually the same council tax. This takes no note of somebody's ability to pay tax at all. Look at the national insurance contributions. We have a rate of about 12% on incomes between £6,240 and £50,000, and beyond that it is 2%. So the richer you are, smaller proportion of your income goes to national insurance contribution, and that does not seem to be fair. As one of the speakers referred to earlier, we have a tax regime for the well-off. They're a state within a state. For example, a capital gains tax is levied at rates between 10% and 28%, compared to the rates on earned income of between 20% and 45%. Taxing everything as normal people's income is taxed will generate about £14 billion a year for redistribution. Wherever you look, it is this regressive policy all around us. Look at the contributions, the tax relief on pension contributions. The government last year gave about 40 billion, and about 10% of the taxpayers received about half of that. There are 1.3 million individuals in this country who are enrolled on pension schemes, but their annual income is less than 12,500 a year. That means they receive zero support from the state. They are the poorest. They have somehow managed to put something into a pension, and they receive absolutely no support of any kind. Personal allowances are now frozen until 2026, but even they are regressive. If you have an increase of £100, that is only worth £20 to a basic rate taxpayer and a £40 to a higher rate taxpayer. There are 18.4 million individuals in the UK whose annual income is less than 12,500. They receive zero, no benefit at all. And the government's even been quibbling about giving £20 a week universal tax credit to these people. So in a nutshell, we have to change all of these policies. We have to think about things like a universal basic income. We have to think about aligning the state pension with a minimum wage. A state pension at the moment is less than half the minimum wage, which is crazy. And when about 14.5 million people are living in poverty, they simply cannot put away enough money for a private pension. They will be relying upon a state pension when they retire. So we have about 3 to 3.5 million people each year treated for malnutrition, and about 1.3 million out of those are over 65. So we condemn our retirees to a life of misery and insecurity. That is not the sign of a happy society, a just society. We have become a society which is far removed from the Christian ideals, and we need to do something about this, and no doubt we will have a chat about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers. And just a reminder that if you've got any questions for any of them, please put them in the chat, but please send them direct to Daniel so that we can kind of sift through them and find them more easily. And if you've got a question for a particular speaker, feel free to put that there as well. But I'm going to start with a couple from me just to get the ball rolling. Paul, you touched a little bit on the need to celebrate the good guys in the middle of a narrative about tax that is often focused on those that avoid it and on the really negative stories. And quite rightly so, there are plenty of negative stories to tell on this matter, but particularly about celebrating the good guys. How do you think we can change that narrative about tax so that people and corporations see it as a really good and worthwhile thing to do? I know I talked about that being something that we tried to do with Patriots Pay Tax, but I think it's something that definitely needs more to be done. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on how we can do that, and I'll come to you first on that, Paul.
Yeah, I actually don't think it's about changing the narrative. I think we've changed the narrative. I think the vast majority of the UK population are where we are and want to see politicians take action. I mean, if you're to believe what you hear from these various focus groups, etc., that all the Conservatives are hearing when they go into these red wall focus groups is the individuals there are deeply concerned about tax justice. And that's one of the reasons Rishi Sunak has felt compelled to actually raise the corporation tax rate in 2023, it's projected, to 25%. Again, another unthinkable thing even 2 years ago. So we've changed the narrative. We've just got to be mindful that there are other people out there now to change it back. So I'm seeing issues such as you touched on Ireland, people saying, yeah, but it's Ireland's democratic right to set low tax rates. It's Ireland's democratic right to have a race to the bottom. We wouldn't have the same argument if somebody said, Ireland wants to carry on manufacturing CFCs, and if they destroy the ozone layer, so what? We wouldn't have that. We wouldn't say Bermuda wants to keep manufacturing lead additives, petrol. That's fine. It's their democratic right. We need to do the final push, which is it is unworthy of a nation to enable tax avoidance as it is to dump pollution and breach human rights. It's that serious an issue.
I don't know if any of the other panelists have anything to add on that point. Yeah, Marianne, I'll come to you first and then Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with what Paul has said. I mean, you know, there's been transformation with the government's attitudes to tax and corporation tax in particular. I also think that the idea that there's a sort of loss of sovereignty from having a globally agreed tax rate that we agree to, that we are part of agreeing to, assumes that we have this sovereignty at the moment. When you've got multinational corporations that are able to decide to offshore profits to another, to another jurisdiction in order to avoid paying tax in the UK, we do not have control over our tax. We are not able to ensure that companies that are trading in the UK, employing people in the UK, selling goods in the UK, are actually paying the same rate of tax as national or local companies that can't get into all these tax avoidance things are having to do. You know, that's the rate that we've set, and these corporations are able to avoid it. So I think we need to turn that sovereignty question around and say this is actually about ensuring that people pay a rate of tax that we have decided in the UK and in partnership with global partners is a fair one. And it's about taking back sovereignty from large corporations who've been trying to undermine it.
I think, Justin, you had something to add to there as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add something, particularly for, those of us who are part of a faith community, that it seems to me that at the heart of the question about the narrative of taxation is the vision of society that we have. And essentially, there can be a vision which is very individualistic, and we know that, that has been churned out for us for many, many years. Or we can have a vision which is far more collectivist. Pope Francis, in particular, has been talking a lot about this in recent years, that we need to understand ourselves as human beings as part of a wider society. And the reason this relates to taxation is that if we have an individualistic framework, then it's very easy to go down a route that says, well, what are my taxes getting for me? Whereas I think if we have a wider vision that understands our role in society much more in terms of our contribution to the common good, then we simply ask a different question. How are these taxes contributing to the common good? And I just think that's a particular role we as a faith community can play in continually advocating for that different vision of society. It is one about the collective, it's about the common good. And obviously not just the faith community, many people of no faith also have a similar vision, but it's a particular distinctive that we have as Christians.
Fantastic. Yeah, we had a few questions in actually on the difference between that kind of individual and corporate tax, and the perception that corporations are more easily able to avoid tax than individuals, or particularly kind of high worth individuals as well, and where that all kind of falls out. And I guess, Marianne, you touched a little bit on that as well, in terms of how poorer individuals often are kind of at the are disadvantaged by the tax system. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts or anything to add to that, on that difference between individuals and taxation and corporates when it comes to taxation. That I think you're right, Paul, that the majority of the country are with us in terms of big businesses paying tax, but less with us when it comes to individuals paying more tax. We've heard quite a lot recently that it's definitely not the time to put taxes up when we're in the pandemic recovery, but it often feels like it's never going to be the time to put taxes up on individuals. So I wonder where that balance comes between, yes, we're very happy to see moves like we saw at the weekend for corporations, but what that means for individuals. And I don't know who wants to jump in first on that, perhaps Prem.
I think one of the big problems we have in our society, just thinking about COVID, the answer is a vaccine. But even bigger problem we have is intoxication with private accumulation of wealth, power, and status. And there is no vaccine for that. The only antidote is good education, thinking about the kind of society we want to build. And the lead for that is not really provided by many. Certainly you won't see that in Parliament. You only have to look at the register of members' interests, and you see how many legislators are basically consultants to big corporations run by rich people. And these rich people also fund political parties. They can have meetings with ministers. You go to a party annual conference, pay £10,000, and you will sit at a dinner table with a minister. You can burn his or her ears. You can meet their advisors and try to influence the agenda. So the point I'm trying to make is that we are looking in some ways the consequences of something. And it is the consequences of the way power is organized in our society, and that needs to change. We need to change the political system, the way we cast our ballots, the way political parties are funded, and we need more transparency. One of the proposed the policy ideas I've been pushing for a long time is that the tax returns of all major corporations and rich people should be publicly available so that we can all see what taxes they are paying or not paying. Yet not aware of any government, at least in the UK, which has ever supported that idea. I'm aware that they have actually opposed it. So this is, so these people's corporate and the rich people prioritize their concerns. Earlier I read out the consequences of regressive taxation. Yet when you read or listen to parliamentary debates, there are so many MPs and lords who will be standing up. Indeed, we have a debate about it tomorrow, who will be arguing we got to reduce the corporate rate of tax. The rich are, paying already 30% plus of the total income tax revenues in the UK. When they say that, they don't feel a sense of shame that the country has such unequal distribution of income, that the rich have to pay that much. Let us redistribute it. But I don't think we're going to achieve it really without a major change in our political system. And I don't know how the others feel about that.
Who wants to go next on that one? No one. Fantastic. Oh, yeah, Paul. We'll come to you then, Paul.
Yes.
So I mean, strictly speaking, Fair Tax Foundation, we're all about corporations and corporation tax, but we work in a broader alliance. And the one thing I would observe, having worked very closely with Tax Justice UK, for example, who are doing wonderful work in and around wealth taxes, which is on individuals, is that it feels to me we are at a tipping moment on wealth taxes as we are with corporation tax on both sides of the Atlantic. So the Biden-Harris economic plan that's taking place over in the US isn't just seeing increases in corporation tax. There are serious proposals around wealth taxes. We can have the moment on wealth taxes here if we mobilise in a sensible way.
Yeah, Marianne.
Yeah, just following up on that, and it's something that somebody's actually raised in the chat about realizing that somebody who had an income twice the size of them was paying half the tax because their income came from wealth rather than from earnings. And I mean, I agree with Paul. Tax Justice UK has done phenomenal work on this. IPPR did quite a lot of polling work around taxing income from wealth equally with income from earnings, and showed that it was very popular because actually it chimes with people's notion of what is and isn't fair. The idea that a care worker who is going out to work in the middle of the pandemic is paying higher rate of tax than somebody who is getting an income from share dividends just strikes at the heart of people's sense of unfairness. And I think you can make that argument. I think in terms of personal tax, I mean, you are right. People are always happier about taxing other people than they are about taxing themselves. But you can make an argument that's about self-interest. You can make an argument that, just as Justin said at the beginning in terms of corporations and how corporations benefit, we all benefit from the services that tax partially pays towards. One of the things we call for at the Women's Budget Group is a free universal childcare. Now, that would require subsidy, some of the money of which would come from taxation. Now, I might not need childcare anymore. My children are a bit older, but if I want to go to see a GP and my GP can't get to work because the childcare arrangements have broken down, or my staff can't get to work because their childcare arrangements have broken down, that has an impact on me, and that has an impact on the organisation I run. So even if you can't, I think that the justice argument should be enough, but where it's not, there are very, very strong self-interest arguments that we can make.
Brilliant. We've had a question sent in, which I'm going to ask to all four of you in turn, so please all be prepared for this one. And Alan says, can I ask the panel what would be the first change they would introduce to achieve a fairer tax system, and why they would choose to make that a particular priority? We'll come to you on that one first, Justin.
Oh, am I really only allowed one? But if I am only allowed one, I've got to go global. And I would say a different solution to what was agreed at the weekend. Not only would I go for a rate of 25%, a global minimum corporate tax rate of 25%, I would change what are known as the Pillar 1 rules so that they're more in line with the proposal that's come out of a range of economists called the minimum effective tax rate proposal, the META proposal. So I would want to change the proposal that was agreed, or at least outlined on Saturday, to 25% plus the META proposal, which would really represent a radical reform of global taxation. If I'm allowed a second one, it'd be council tax.
I'll let you off with the second one there, seeing as it was so short and sweet. Paul, you next. What would your one thing be?
Well, because I go second, I can just say, like Justin said, and on top of, I think we need to look at, and this is something Prem has wrote about so articulately, way ahead of the curve. We need to look at how debt is treated in the system, and businesses that are basically leveraged through debt to the point where they will never pay corporation tax, and it's a deliberate mechanism, versus equity. And I think the tax reliefs that are available for debt need to be lowered quite significantly. And I actually suspect it would lead to a very significant increase in corporation tax revenues, not just amongst big business. I think this is quite an endemic device amongst a lot of small businesses as well.
Prem, will come to you next.
Well, I suppose I should say, in addition to what Justin and Paul have recommended, I would really try to drastically reduce, if not abolish, value-added tax, because that really hits the poorest the hardest. And so I would reform VAT. I would also create a kind of additional levels of VAT on luxury goods so that the rich have to pay more. So my reform is about VAT.
And Marianne, without making this into an I went shopping and I bought kind of game, what would you offer for?
It is the advantage of going last, isn't it? That you can say you could agree with everybody, and also to be the really boring person to say you don't want to reform the tax system by one single change. Actually, there's a whole lot of different changes that interrelate. But I did want to follow up on Justin's point about council tax and the need to reform local taxation, because I think that's a really big issue. Hugely regressive system, and I think we need, in the short term, we need to revise the council tax banding. But I actually think we need to move to a system that is based on, that's much more like a local income tax or a land value tax or something like that. Which, I mean, taxing land has the advantages. It's not that, it's there, you can't move it, you can't hide it, and do away with the current system, which is hugely unfair and regressive.
Brilliant. Paul, we've had a question in which I'm hoping you might maybe be able to answer for us, which is how many professional football clubs have signed up to the fair tax mark, just like Oxford Council have, and could they be good role models in their communities for others to follow? I don't know if you've got numbers on that, but
so it's easy. It's zero, and we've considered it because I think when the football clubs have taken on the living wage, like Liverpool and Everton, and extended it right through the catering staff and the ticketing staff, it really has made an impact in those communities. Unfortunately, most football clubs are either making a loss and wouldn't pay tax, or they are the plaything of rich individuals or oppressive regimes and don't pay tax. So either way, it doesn't look like it's an area that's going to be right for us for a few years yet, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. Shame to hear that it's zero, but I can hear the reasons for that anyway. And a question that I'm going to ask to you, Justin, from someone said that how can we frame this debate in a more global context? We might be struggling a little bit financially ourselves, but in a global context, we could see ourselves as rich. Will making the global giants pay more tax actually benefit uneducated women in sub-Saharan Africa, or will it just give Western governments more money to pay off the debts they've incurred throughout the pandemic?
What a great question, thank you. Well, the current proposal, the one that was agreed on Saturday, won't especially help girls' education in Zambia or Tanzania or whatever. The proposal that I mentioned and that's there, as it were, sitting on the table ready to be picked up, which is the meter proposal, potentially could, well, certainly would actually transfer far greater sums to lower income countries. So it depends how you reform the global tax rules as whether that extra revenue ends up in the bank accounts in places in the US, especially in the UK, or whether it might end up potentially in the government accounts in sub-Saharan Africa and so on. How do we make it global? I think I just want to make this point. I think we need to talk about tax justice far more than we do. absolutely rightly, there's been a lot of attention today to the fact that, you know, including from faith leaders, about the reduction from 0.7 to 0.5% GDP that's going to aid. And there's been a lot of noise about that from the faith community. There's been far less noise about global tax justice. And yet, actually, that reduction from 0.7 to 0.5 is worth about $4 billion per year. The changes that we're talking about, even the change just from 21% to 15%, is worth $4 billion a year for India alone. In other words, the sums of money potentially involved for lower income countries could be far higher if we had a fairer global tax system. I'm not against aid, don't anyone please interpret that as being against aid, but the sums are much, much larger. And so I really think we need to talk about reforming the global tax rules in a much fairer way than was proposed on Saturday.
Brilliant, thank you, Justin. That brings me quite nicely actually to the next question I was going to ask, which is what you as a panel would like to see faith communities doing and saying on tax justice. I'm aware that plenty of us in this call are involved in faith communities, whether that's at a local or a national level, and I wonder if there's anything more that we could be doing. Paul, I'll come to you first. I know you spoke quite glowingly at the start about some of the work that you've done with faith communities over the years. So I wonder if you can start us off with what else we could be doing.
So I've been quite privileged way back to be there at the beginning of fair trade, whether it was fair trade towns or fair trade products. I worked in the co-op for 20 years. So we were producing all the first coffees. We were writing the standards before there were standards. And at virtually every juncture, it was the faith community driving the uptake of those products in the first instance. And sometimes those products were rubbish. The first coffees were atrocious, I'll be honest with you, and the chocolate, awful. And you know what? You guys bought them, built the scale till they actually improved. So I saw it in socially responsible investment. The very first funds, who was buying them? It was you guys. Yeah, I've seen you as first movers all over this. Please get involved in Turk's Action for Tax Justice. Get involved in Tax Justice Sunday. Build Church Action for Tax Justice up and up so it's big. So it's big, and politicians are coming knocking on the door seeking approval. Yeah, help them get big. That would be my plea, and we will then work with them to get the detail right.
Justin, I'll come to you next as our representative from Church Action on Tax Justice.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I mean, I've got to be honest. I'm going to be quite personal here. I'm going to agree with everything that Paul has said. You know, the truth is that Church Action for Tax Justice, we're tiny, we're small. We've really struggled to raise funds over the last couple of years, and that's been a real problem for us. And yet, I was going to say the work we're doing, but what I'm trying to get at is, I think in the church space or in the faith community space, tax justice needs to become, I guess, like our Jubilee 2.0. You know, we saw, well, Paul mentioned it earlier, the success of the Jubilee debt campaign around the year 2000. I think tax justice is the new issue that churches need to get on board with. You know, we've been going a couple of years, we've had some success, but it needs to be far more common that churches talk about this, and it becomes part of their bread and butter, much as the world, much in the same way that Global South debt has been. And there are loads of resources. I suppose I've spent the last 2 years writing a load of resources specifically for churches for them to engage on issues of tax justice. So just have a look at our website if that's something you've not done before, but talk about it in your faith community so that this becomes an issue just as significant for us as a community.
Great. And I don't know if Marianne or Prem have anything to add on that particular point.
I don't think Prem, I've got anything to add. Sorry.
Great, we'll come to you, Prem.
Let Marianne go first. Let Marianne go first.
I was just saying I don't think I've got anything to add to what Paul and Justin have said. I think they've summed it up brilliantly.
And then we'll come to you then, Prem.
Okay. I mean, in one of the earliest events when we started Tax Justice Network was trying to get people to support us. I remember writing for the Guardian newspaper before we formed TJN an article, and one of the sub-editors phoned me and said, "Why are you writing about tax avoidance? It's all right, isn't it? Governments are corrupt. We shouldn't really be giving them our money." And then I had a dialogue, and they eventually published the article, and we then rolled on from there eventually ended up training some of the Guardian journalists on how to read company accounts and how to make sense of them and all that kind of thing. One of the earliest events we held was or I was invited to speak, was at Ely Cathedral. And that was quite interesting because there was an audience which was quite familiar with the issues from the Bible about taxation, and they were easily persuaded to support us. And that was a great thing. I'm also persuaded by the book written by E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. And the question is, when against all the odds, how on earth did our predecessors manage to secure some rights, whether it's the right to vote, right to a trade union, notions of equality, social justice? And the answer is that they campaigned on every possible front, whether it was in cathedrals, churches, they wrote songs, they used music, they used theatre, they used cartoons, they used anything and everything. So as faith communities, we can mobilize all of these resources to connect with the people. There are people out there who are suffering in silence, and there is absolutely no need for this. And we can help them by securing tax justice with the simple purpose of enabling everyone to live a fulfilling life. And that is what, to my mind, tax justice ultimately is all about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Prem. And we'll come now to our final question, which is kind of a quick fire one sentence question, if you like, and I'll come to you first on this, Marianne, because I very unfairly made you go the last time round. But what one thing can we as individuals on this call, whether we're Christians or not, do to pursue tax justice? And also, if you have any kind of concluding remarks you want to add to that question as well, do feel free. We'll come to you first, Marianne.
Can I say two things? One is to support the campaigns that are out there, and have a look at Christians for Tax Justice and other organisations and Tax Justice UK's work. And the other is talk to friends and family and colleagues, because actually one of the things that really the thing that is most persuasive in changing people's minds is a conversation with somebody that they know and trust, far more than celebrities or media adverts or anything else. Actually having people that they know and trust raising things in general conversations, saying, I've just seen this and it doesn't seem fair, what do you think? And that really starts to get people's minds opening. So yeah, those are the two things.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prem. I'll get you to go next on that question.
I think we should be doing what we are doing here, that is speaking up, trying to demystify things, like you can't really shackle corporate tax avoidance. Some people would say you can't really make the rich pay more. You can't really shackle the tax avoidance industry. We continue to generate policy proposals to connect with people's common sense and remind them that there is no invisible hand of fate which is controlling their destiny. It is a visible hand of tax avoidance which really is impairing their life chances, and together we can all do something about it.
Brilliant. Paul, your turn next.
So if this is about what individuals can do, and I'm going to assume most of the audience are already using their votes wisely, for me it would be you boycott the baddies and you shop with the goodies, and you put your money where your mouth is. Now, I know, so what that means is you get your keys cut, you go to Timpson's. You get a new stereo, you go to Richie Sounds. You got a grocery shop, you go to the Co-op. Yeah, you need some smelly bath bombs for your bath, you go Lush, right? Flip side, and I know we can't boycott everybody, but should you be using Amazon? No point moaning about Amazon and then using them, etc. We can't boycott them all. Pick half of the big tech baddies and boycott half of them or something. Yeah, that would be my thing.
Brilliant. And last but by no means least, Justin, hopefully you've got something to add to that shopping list of things we've heard.
Well, not really. I'm just going to nick, or whatever the phrase is, Marianne's. I think talk about it. We in our churches in particular, I mean, I know this firsthand, we're very reluctant to talk about money, probably even more reluctant to talk about tax. And I would just say, talk about it. Talk about it with your friends, talk about it in your home groups, talk about it in your Bible study groups. I'll give you materials to do that. talk about tax justice so that it becomes an issue about which we as a community are concerned.
I think that's a fantastic point to end on. And I'll end by saying a massive thank you to all four of our panel tonight. Thank you so much for giving up your Monday night for what was a really entertaining and really helpful, I think, conversation that we've had there. As many of the panel have mentioned, this is Fair Tax Week. Tonight is only the start of it. There are plenty of other events organised by other brilliant people and organisations throughout this week. We'll be sharing some of those on Twitter, or if you check out the hashtag Celebrating Fair, there's plenty more information, resources. So please don't let this be the end of the conversation. We're very much at the start of Fair Tax Week, and we hope that it's not just a week, but it's a conversation that continues well beyond tonight. If you are a member of Christians on the Left, this is, again, just the start of the conversation. This is the first in our 2021 summer school series. We did it last year and it was so popular. We're back again this year on Zoom. So come back next week, same time, same place, or maybe a different room of your house if you like, for our next event, at which our director, Lou Davis, will be interviewing Annalisa Dodds MP about how Labour can win the next general election. If you're not a member and that sounds like a conversation that you'd like to hear and like to be involved in, you can join at our website and we'll be delighted to have you as a member. That's it from me and from our panel tonight. But once again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for speaking, and thank you for all your fantastic questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.